Good evening. Thank you for joining Mental Wealth Wednesday. I am Corey Minor Smith with Corey Empowers, and every Wednesday, the fourth Wednesday of each month, we have a new episode of Mental Wealth Wednesday. And in celebration of National Fair Housing Month, April, we have a very special guest who has established a wonderful career in helping individuals with fair housing matters. Attorney Stephen Dane is with us today, semi-retired, a prolific author, and has had an extraordinary career in civil rights and specifically fair housing. Thank you for joining us today, Attorney Dane. How are you?
I'm doing fine, and thank you, Corey, for recognizing Fair Housing Month, which is an important month every year for those of us in this world. And we need to get the word out that fair housing is important, and shows like this help to educate the public about the meaning of fair housing and why it's important. And so I very much appreciate you inviting me to be here.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I do appreciate you coming on. I believe that your career is something that we can learn from, that helps people to understand how their everyday lives are impacted by laws, and they may not even know it. So jumping right into that, tell me about the type of cases that you have represented clients for.
Well, I've done just about everything that you can imagine in the fair housing arena. I started off representing individuals that had fair housing problems that were referred to me by the local fair housing organization. That eventually I had some pretty good success representing individuals. And so the Fair Housing Center, specifically the Toledo Fair Housing Center, began to send me some more complicated cases that might have had a broader impact than just an individual victim. So, for example, I started taking on banks, savings and loans when they existed, mortgage companies, and so forth. Also had some success with those more complicated financial type transactions. And the relief that we would get was broader based because we could get relief for entire communities. And then moved on to a couple of class actions. At one point, my clients and I, which were fair housing organizations and some individuals, filed discrimination complaints against pretty much every single large property and casualty insurer in the entire country. So to answer your question, a wide range of different types of cases. And the protections under the fair housing laws extend nationally to race, religion, sex, gender, disability, children, and so forth. And in some states, there are even broader protections. I've had just about every one of those kinds as well.
How did you get involved with the fair housing civil rights movement?
Yeah, I never went to law school to become specifically a civil rights lawyer, and didn't even know what fair housing was when I became a lawyer. But I started my career in a large local law firm that encouraged its young associates like me to dabble in anything and everything related to the law. So the first couple of years that I was had my law license, I did real estate closings, I did trusts and estates, I did small litigation cases, breach of contract cases. I formed corporations, just about everything except, patents and intellectual property. That was not something that we did. The firm really encouraged us to just try everything to see where we had our niche. I even did criminal defense law for a while. And I eventually settled into the role as a litigator. I liked the challenges of lawsuits, litigation, solving problems through the court process. There's a lot of strategic thinking. It's like playing chess. to some extent. So once I got into the litigation arena, that's what I knew I was going to do. But even after a couple of years, I had no idea that I wanted to do fair housing or civil rights work. The local executive director of the Toledo Fair Housing Center, a woman by the name of Shauna Smith, who is a legend in fair housing circles, called up one of the senior partners at my firm, and she said, look, we're doing our fair housing cases with solo practitioners in small firms, 2 to 3 lawyer firms, and we are getting beat up by big law firms who just come in and overpower our lawyers. We need a big law firm to help us do fair housing cases. Would your firm be willing to do that? And he said, yeah, and I think I know just the guy. It was me. So he asked if I would be willing to do it. I said, sure. What's this all about? But I'll learn it. I met with Shauna. She referred the first case to me. I worked it all up and had it all ready to go. And I went into the senior partner and I said, here it is. Here's what I got. And of course, I had to report to him what was going on. And he helped me out. And he said, okay, well, who were the defendants? It was just some small couple that had a couple of rental properties. And I told him who the defendants were, and his face just dropped.
Oh.
He said, those are my godparents. I can't sue my godparents. I was crushed. I mean, I thought I was so excited. A little bit of a conflict there. I apologized profusely to Shauna, but by that time she had developed the case. There was testing. It was a strong case. We had developed a relationship, and she said, don't worry about it, Steve. The next one that comes along, I'll refer to you. Well, after that, it was, one case and then 2 cases and then 4 cases. And as I said, I had some good success. I had been trained at a big law firm by very experienced litigation attorneys who did litigation generally. So I learned first how to be a lawyer and a good lawyer and a litigator before I even thought about doing civil rights work.
Mm.
So I started doing these plaintiff fair housing cases, which my firm said was okay. We believe in fair housing. That's fine, even though it was a big firm and did a lot of defense work. I ended up sort of becoming well-versed in employment defense law, Title VII defense work. And that was great work because, we knew we were going to get paid. It was high hourly rates. Most of our clients were Fortune 500 companies.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of work that I did to sort of pay the bills. But then these plaintiff fair housing cases, especially to start, were little cases. They were contingent, right? Mm-hmm. I didn't charge the clients anything unless we settled the case or won. But those were the fun ones. Mm-hmm. I discovered that the plaintiff fair housing cases really turned me on and really got me excited. And it got to the point after about 4, 5, 6 years, Corey, of doing that kind of work, I found that I had like 50% of my time was spent on employment defense matters. 50% of my time was spent on plaintiff fair housing cases. And I would show up regularly in local federal court. And I remember one time I went in for a pretrial on a case, and the federal judge there, Judge Potter, who was a great guy, great sense of humor, and a very pleasant individual, said, "So, Mr. Dane," he said, "are you here on the side of justice and rightness, or are you here on the side of evil?" Because who knows? It could have been an employment defense case or a plaintiff fair housing case. And I had to say, "Judge, I'm always here on the side of rightness. It's just a question of whether I'm a plaintiff in a fair housing case or a defendant in an employment case." So he understood that it was easy for me to to wear a different hat depending on who the client was. So, for about 10 years, my practice gradually grew from large Fortune 500 contract disputes, employment defense work, and so forth, gradually into the more and more fair housing cases, particularly, and as I said earlier, they got more complicated. They got Shauna Smith would started to develop and send to me cases not about landlord-tenant discrimination, which was very common, but mortgage redlining, bank redlining. She at one point, around the time that she moved to the National Fair Housing Alliance, she and her staff had figured out that I was handling more mortgage lending redlining, mortgage lending discrimination cases than the entire U.S. Department of Justice.
Wow.
I had like 7 or 8 going, maybe not all at the same time, but within the span of a couple of years. And DOJ was not doing much at the time.
Right.
They had maybe 2 or 3 going on, which made a big splash. But
can you tell us a little bit about redlining? What is it? What did you look for in the cases, and how were you able to get victory for your clients in those cases?
Redlining is a term used to describe discrimination, usually by a financial company, a bank or an insurance company, because of the racial composition of the neighborhood within which the property is located. So it's a geography-based type of discrimination, not an individual-based. In fact, my very first big redlining case in Toledo involved an area called the Old West End in the late 1980s, which at that time was transitioning from a predominantly low-income Black neighborhood into being gentrified into whites were moving in, the prices were going up, but the banks wouldn't lend money in there because they thought it was a lower income Black neighborhood and they didn't want to put their dollars there. And my first significant redlining case in the Old West End, the seller was white, the buyer of the property was white, and the real estate agent was white, and I believe the head of the local community organization at that time was white, but the racial composition of the neighborhood was 70% Black. And the bank had some rules or guidelines where it basically said it didn't believe anybody would buy a house in that neighborhood for that amount of money. And so they denied the loan. And so we ended up suing them. We discovered that in fact, a couple of their eligibility criteria and so forth were harming Black neighborhoods. Even though the value of the houses were going up, the banks wouldn't support that. And the appraisers wouldn't support that. But we were successful, and we got a favorable court decision, even though the participants in the loan and the sale transaction and seeking the mortgage loan, even though they were white people, they were engaging in behavior in the Black neighborhood that is just as illegal because of the bank using the racial composition of the neighborhood to make a decision, as if they had all been Black and the bank had turned them down because they were Black. So that's the basis for redlining, is a geographic. Now, in the redlining space, generally speaking, you need to have a lot more information to put a case together than simply what happened to the two people involved in the transaction, or just involved in the mortgage loan application itself. We were able to develop that information through public records, Community Reinvestment Act disclosures, and we also had our clients generally in the mortgage lending field are given the reasons why their loan was denied. We can tell often whether the reason given was because of a characteristic of the applicant, for example, a credit report or something involving their employment or income, or whether the decision was based upon some factor having to do with the property or what's going on in the neighborhood, in which case that would be a redlining claim. Okay, Corey, I lost you for a second.
Yeah, it just
okay.
Went out. But thank you. You were explaining this another segment of the redlining, so apologize for that.
Yeah. Well, another thing that's interesting about redlining claims, Corey, is oftentimes in traditional, smallish, individual instances of discrimination, not all the time, but for the first 10, 12, 15 years of my practice, when I had those smaller cases, I didn't rely upon any kind of disparate impact type of theory. It was just straight out, differing treatment, intentional discrimination. With a lot of financial transactions like mortgage lending, appraisal, insurance, property insurance, there is the possibility that rules or guidelines that the company has adopted will have a discriminatory or racial impact, an adverse impact on an entire group of people without a sufficient business justification. Those cases are a little bit, they're both easier and harder. They're easier in the sense that once you know what the policy is, you can conduct a statistical analysis to determine whether it's going to have a disparate impact on a protected class. Mm-hmm. You don't need to develop any differing treatment. So in that sense, it's easier. On the other hand, it's harder because you have to wade through all of the business justifications as to why it's there and be able to figure out which ones are real and which ones are not.
Yeah, many would be neutral in their face, and
right.
You would have to show through application how they're discriminatory.
Right. And in the insurance context, one of the rules that we challenged was a rule that the insurers would not sell their best insurance policies if for any property that was over 30 years old. Mm-hmm. Okay, that was it, 30 years. Never looked at the condition of the property or anything. They justified that, and of course, with a 30 or 40-year-old property age guideline, our statistics showed that wiped out. It eliminated perhaps 70% of the housing stock owned by white owners, but over 90% of the housing stock owned by Black homeowners. Okay, so there was a big difference there as to what the impact of that was. Well, the insurance companies said, well, older houses, they have more issues. There's higher risk. We're going to have to pay more claims, more frequency claims, and so forth. And because they're old houses. Mm-hmm. And we looked at that, and we looked at it closely. And first of all, we discovered that they had no data to support it. And when we did get the data and forced them to look at the analysis, even their own experts found that there was sort of a bell curve to the number of claims and the amount of the claims and the frequency of claims. And what happens is from the years 0 to 10 of a new house, very few claims. And if there are any claims, they're very minimal. From about 10 or 15 years to 25 years, then the claims start to go up. The roof gets old, the plumbing breaks, has to be fixed, the HVAC system wears out, something happens and causes a fire or something. So the claims start to build up. But then you know what happens? after 25 or 30 years, the claims start to go down. And the reason is because people replace all their systems after 25 or 30 years. They replace the roof, they replace the HVAC, the plumbing is upgraded, the electrical is upgraded. So after 30 years of age, if you've had those things done to your house could be in better condition. And in fact, the statistics showed that the frequency and the severity of insurance claims decreased for houses over 30 years old, even though the insurance companies were refusing to sell insurance. That's a classic example of a facially neutral business rule that was having a disparate impact on a basis of race against Black homeowners, which was unjustified by data or any business necessity.
Wow. So with dealing with mortgages, and I'm just thinking from my personal experience of, being a homeowner, property appraisals are a factor in the funding and the opportunities for loans. Did you have an opportunity to work with any information that was reported by PAVE, the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity Committee that was established under the Biden administration? And Secretary Fudge, who was the secretary for HUD at the time, was co-chair. But a part of the research for PAVE was to look into the inequities in property valuations and the impact on minoritized communities in terms of the appraisal values of their properties being lower in many cases.
Yes. Well, let me answer this way. I worked on part of the PAVE project. I worked with the National Fair Housing Alliance when that project was underway, and assisted them in the development of their report on the existence and types and extent of appraisal discrimination. When I was litigating appraisal cases, that's been a while since I've litigated an appraisal case myself. Although I know that there are a number of them going on right now all over the country. But when I litigated them back in the 80s and early 90s, what we discovered was that the appraisal process includes a great deal of judgment, individualized judgment by the appraiser.
Subjective,
yes. And the appraiser can make adjustments or make decisions that will affect the ultimate outcome of the quote acceptable value that that may be influenced by racial bias. I remember one case I had where the appraisal came back. My clients had lived in the house for several years and then eventually bought it from the owner. They lived in it as renters and then bought it. It was in a 95% Black neighborhood. They were Black, 95% Black neighborhood. 1 block away was a completely redeveloped neighborhood that had undergone some urban renewal. All the houses there were brand new. Okay. And are about the same size, same construction material, everything as my client's house, which was also not that old. It wasn't brand new, but maybe about 10 or 15 years old. It was in the Black neighborhood, right next door, within 2 blocks or so. And the appraiser, when she went out to use comparables, completely jumped over the neighborhood next door with the new construction. Those houses were worth $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, more. And when I asked her at her deposition, why did you not use any of those recent sales of the new construction as a comparable to my client's house? And she said, well, those houses were just too nice I didn't think it was appropriate to use it, because what she was saying was that the neighborhood wasn't an older, predominantly black neighborhood. It was a nicer white neighborhood. So she didn't think it was comparable. It was 2 blocks away. Anyway, that was, I wouldn't call her a racist, an obvious conscious racist, but she had something going on in her head about why that neighborhood wasn't really comparable to the net one right next door. And it had to do with racial composition.
Mm. Very interesting. A lot of people may not understand or know all of the steps to purchasing a home, and even going through uh, purchasing a home themselves, the significance of the appraisal and
Right.
how the appraisal value is determined. So I think it's important to have conversations like this so that people understand the value of neighborhoods and the possibility and actuality of properties being devalued based on the racial composition, as you're saying now.
Right.
Some people feel like, well, it happened in my neighborhood too. Our properties aren't being estimated by maybe the county auditor each year when they evaluate the properties to be what they feel it's worth. But there is a significant difference, right?
Right. Yeah. And if you, any simple Google or online search on the concept of appraisal discrimination will show several instances where homeowners have black homeowners attempting to sell their home have received what they thought was an underappraisal, and then they I don't know what the term is, but they whitewashed their home. They would have a friend of theirs would come in and substitute all their photographs, their family pictures, and so forth, remove any kind of ethnic indicia that there was a black family living there, and then have it reappraised. And the reappraisals come back $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 more after that. That's when you know there's some kind of a conscious, intentional racial bias going on in the appraisal process. But I'll tell you, it's not easy to detect. It's not easy to determine. Appraisal process is very difficult. The mortgage lending process is very difficult. Even with real estate purchases, sales of houses, you at least have an agent. Most people have an agent that sort of helps them out, who's an expert. Most people don't have an expert helping them out with the mortgage loan process or the appraisal process.
Right. That's unfortunate. And I wish there could be more classes, more information to help people understand and to be aware of what to look for when they are purchasing a home for the first time or selling their home, whatever the case may be. So hopefully the information we're sharing will just pique some interest and help people to know that there's the opportunity to research and look into these types of things to learn more and to make sure they're able to make an informed decision when purchasing a home or even rent.
And in most communities, there are local nonprofit organizations that will assist people to work through that process. There are consumer counseling agencies, fair housing organizations, other credit assistance groups, nonprofit housing assistance organizations that will provide free advice, without having to pay someone to give you the advice.
Thank you for that. With fair housing, we know that the law was passed in the 60s. We're celebrating, and in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King, who fought so hard for civil rights along with so many others. But it was only 7 days after his murder, his assassination, that the Fair Housing Act was signed into law. And now it's still needed in 2025.
Right.
Why do you think that it's still needed? Or why would you say that you agree with me? Why do you agree that it's still needed in 2025?
Well, sadly, 2 reasons. One is that there is a lot of a bias, both intentional and both conscious and unconscious, that individuals have about those who are different from them. It could be racial, it could be disability based, could be gender based, and we don't do a very good job of expanding our circle of our networks of people that we live and work and play with, socialize with in this country, unlike other countries around the world that are more melting pots than us, unfortunately. And the second reason is because I think many corporations, and this is, I'll get into I don't want to get too far into DEI issues, but many corporations and companies who do business, they adopt and implement policies or procedures that have implicit headwinds against traditionally unrepresented people or protected classes, which is why they're protected under the law. And they don't realize how difficult these things are. Some examples of the conscious bias that still exists out there is in the area of zoning. How many zoning officials or community officials will put up barriers to housing for people with disabilities in a neighborhood because the neighbors have some unfounded fear that the people who are going to be living in a group home, for example, are dangerous. People come forward in these zoning cases from the community and say, we don't want that kind of person living in my neighborhood. And then the public officials, buy into that or accede to it because they don't want to get voted out of office. And it perpetuates the bias implicit in the community. So that's still going on all over the place.
Not in my backyard.
And as I said, there are we sometimes, unfortunately laugh that some of the old tricks of the trade of discrimination that we saw companies imposing in the 70s and the 80s that went away after they got sued, and including in the insurance field, after they all got sued in the 90s, they start to come back again. They creep back into the ordinary business practices. And we thought we had rooted them out, and we didn't. And we end up going back into court all over again.
Wow. What's one of the things that you would say crept back in?
Appraisal bias, I think, is one of them. I'm not sure it ever went away, but that was an issue that I was litigating back in the 80s and 90s. And look at it, we're back at it, again, right now. That's the one that comes to mind, most rapidly right now.
I was just thinking about eminent domain proceedings and how those could have a disparate impact. Have you had a case that involved an eminent domain takeover of a property?
No, no. I myself haven't. I have some vague recollection that there may have been some local eminent domain issues, maybe in Detroit a couple of years ago, but I was not involved in that. And that has not, I've never had a client come to me that had a concern about that. So
yeah, that's interesting because nationally interstates have been built and it required removal of whole neighborhoods in order to do so. And many times they are marginalized communities that are disrupted and displaced in order to build a highway or to build a building instead of residents. So I just find that could be a very interesting case if someone or a whole neighborhood class action suit happened for something.
Well, there were several of them in the 70s.
Okay.
That's when the highways came through, right? and they plowed right through the black neighborhoods and avoided the white neighborhoods. There were several cases back in the 70s. That's before my time, but they did not go well. The courts were not really receptive to those kinds of cases. Now, many of them were not strictly, if my memory is, they really didn't rely so much on the Fair Housing Act as much as they did because there was governmental action involved. The more of the civil rights statutes against adverse governmental actions, like 1983 actions, 42 USC 1983. I'm talking legalese here, but and 14th Amendment due process types of things. I think that's what they were based on mostly, not necessarily the Fair Housing Act. And I don't know why, other than perhaps the fact that back in the 70s, the Fair Housing Act was still so new and undeveloped. No one really thought it was going to be that useful or that powerful. It turns out that the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act are two of the strongest, most comprehensive civil rights statutes ever enacted by Congress. Surprisingly enough, they were both bipartisan. Right. The Fair Housing Act was sponsored by both a Democrat and a Republican senator. And the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed with bipartisan support in the first President Bush era. And he's the one that supported that. Yeah. So it's unique in the sense that they were both bipartisan and they were both very strong, because I think even the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both believed in the basic principles of fair housing. People should be able to live where they want to live so long as they can afford it. Yeah. And people with disabilities ought to be able to live where they can want to live and be able to get into places of public accommodation, and shouldn't be excluded simply because they're using a wheelchair or they are blind.
So with all of the changes, we just talked about, bipartisan support, and through the years, there have been different administrations that may have enforced the fair housing laws differently.
Right.
How has the fair housing enforcement changed throughout the time that you've been practicing?
It changes just about, at the federal level, it changes just about every 4 years. Each administration will have different priorities. The protections, it tends to be, I'm not an inside the beltway expert. And frankly, most of I've been a private fair housing lawyer my whole life. Never worked at a nonprofit, never worked in government. Well, I was a law clerk, but I never worked for a government agency other than the court system. So my experience has always been, I had to fight these battles on my own. So I didn't rely on HUD, didn't rely on DOJ. If they wanted to help out, fine. But in all of my cases, I had to do it on my own. So in my experience, it really didn't matter to me whether HUD was aggressive or DOJ was aggressive on racial issues, race cases, or whether they diverted off into families with children enforcement, or disability enforcement, or sexual harassment enforcement. Those have been different priorities for different administrations, Republican and Democratic. It didn't really matter to me, but for my agency clients, my fair housing agency clients, all over the country, HUD has sometimes been very good and very supportive, issuing regulations, drafting regulations, enforcing the law, accepting complaints, investigating them well, and then that will go on for 3, 4, 5 years, and then a new administration might come in, and suddenly everything sort of slows down and backs off. And suddenly race cases are put on the back burner, and sexual harassment cases are put on the front burner. That becomes the fair housing issue of for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. It's a roller coaster for people who have to rely on the HUD and the Department of Justice. You never know quite what you're going to get with the new administration. Now, at the same time, there's a very dedicated, devoted group of public servants who I would call the frontline attorneys, mm-hmm. the attorneys they're the trial attorneys at HUD and DOJ that are very good, and they're very aggressive, and they really want to do the best they can in as many cases as they can. But when the bosses, at headquarters in Washington, D.C. is saying, no, we're not going to let you file that case, what can they do? They can't do anything about it. So thankfully, as administrations change, come and go, a lot of those frontline attorneys are still there. They're lifetime people, and the work still gets done. It just slows down a little bit. What's very concerning now in the present, April 2025, is that a lot of those long-time career civil rights, fair housing enforcement attorneys are either getting fired, or they're having to leave, or they're getting reassigned to non-civil rights positions. And that's got to be very disheartening.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately to the complainant, because they won't have any recourse for, wrongdoings that could clearly have been there if the investigation found probable cause, for example, and it just needs to go to the next level of addressing the case.
Not unless they can find a private attorney. And believe me, there are very few of us around the country. At one point, we had, this was like 10, 15 years ago, we probably had 5 attorneys in the state of Ohio that I would say are regular, competent, fair housing attorneys. Mm-hmm. And, many of us have retired or semi-retired. And now I can only name 1 or 2 throughout the entire state of Ohio. And I don't know what it's like in other states. Every state in the country has very few experienced fair housing attorneys, and some states have none. So, mm-hmm. So it's for those victims that you mentioned, Corey, that can't rely on HUD for their individual claims to become investigated. I don't know what they're going to do. They're going to have to rely on private fair housing organizations, if there mm-hmm. are any. There are many states that don't have any private fair housing groups either.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing that. It is kind of discouraging because we know clearly that there are a lot of cases out there, and people who are brave enough to pursue enforcement of their rights in their lives in terms of living in the community. And I'm thinking specifically for those who have disabilities, mental health disabilities, as well as physical disabilities, and having to rely on governmental entities or nonprofits or other community-based organizations for various services that could be impacted by the priorities of whichever administration is in office, and specifically for ones that have been defunded during this current administration.
Right. And it is unfortunate, and it's especially unfortunate because the largest category of fair housing complaints now arise in the field of disability. It has mm-hmm. far surpassed the number of race-based discrimination cases. So people with disabilities, whether it's a mobility disability or a mental health disability or um, developmental disability. Those are the people that are getting discriminated against more frequently now.
Mhm.
They are the ones that need the resources, need the help. Oftentimes, the fix or the way to get them proper relief is very simple. It's low cost or no cost
Right.
to the housing provider, and it's unfortunate that they can't get these the remedies that they're entitled to under the law. It could be a ramp, from the street up to the front door of a house, minimal expense. It could be permitting someone with an emotional anxiety disorder to have an emotional support animal live in the dwelling, even if there's a no pets policy. Well, an emotional support animal is not considered a pet. It's considered a mobility or a disability aid. So those are the kinds of things that pop up all the time. They constitute most of the complaints that are filed. They're easily resolved, and yet with people don't know that they have rights under the Fair Housing Act to those simple fixes.
Right. And it's the responsibility of homeowners, property landlords, to know their responsibility in addressing reasonable accommodations.
Yeah.
Right. So a resident of your home, if you are renting a property, may submit a request. They are called reasonable accommodation requests, or it could be a modification request. They may not use those magic words, but they are asking you for something that could help them in fully enjoying the place where they live.
Right. And it's shocking to me. Now, maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, but it's shocking to me how many small business people become landlords. They're into the property management business. Okay, once you rent out a house, who do not know the law. Now, come on, if you're gonna engage in property management and be a landlord and rent property, you have to understand what the laws are. You can't profess later on, when you have a complaint filed against you for discrimination against a person who's asked for an emotional support animal, and complain about the Fair Housing Act, or complain that I didn't know what the law was. Well, that's your obligation to understand what the law is. The information is out there. I mean, just do a simple Google search. What are my obligations under the Fair Housing Act as a landlord? Boom, you'll get 150 websites, all of which will give you advice from the American Apartment Association, or from the other property management trade organizations, or from fair housing organizations,
or wherever you're getting your standard form lease.
It's
probably an organization that has this information as well. So.
Yeah, it's surprising how many forms that are illegal, that contain illegal stuff. Yeah.
That's unfortunate too. So perhaps we need to advocate for some type of law on the local level, if you're going to become a property owner, to have like at least a class before you actually rent out your space.
Well, in Ohio, there is a requirement that real estate professionals with licenses, get fair housing training.
Do you have to have a license to?
No.
Right. So that's
landlord. No, you don't have to do anything.
Right. That's what I'm saying. And we need to advocate for a class that property owners, real estate investors that are renting out,
have to certify that they've attended a 3-hour class or something.
Yes.
By a responsible trainer.
Yes. And maybe we need an accreditation. That's what we could do. We can create an accreditation program for those who can train and provide the requisite knowledge before one signs the first lease. I think that's a great idea, Dane. So you can't fully retire yet.
No. As the advice here is free.
So what do you see for the future of fair housing?
Well, I think we will soldier on. I think we will survive, as I said. I think deep down, fundamentally, despite sometimes the peripheral griping, deep down, I think fair housing is a bipartisan supported issue. I think it always has been. I think it always will continue to be. There might be some disagreements about the extent or level of discrimination that goes on, but I think that we'll keep going on. Recall that I'll remind people that before the Fair Housing Initiatives Program was put into place, which is the federal grant program to fund fair housing, private fair housing agencies to help HUD enforce the Fair Housing Act. Private fair housing agencies were operating anyway. I mean, with private funding, donations, local grants, and so forth. Even if the federal funding over the next couple of years dries up or slows down a little bit, I think the private fair housing groups will still be able to function and survive. They'll just have to scramble around to carry on. I've worked extensively over the last several years with a newer generation of attorneys who want to do fair housing work. And I'm available to all of them with assistance and legal research and guidance and briefs. I do that every day with people who ask me. And there's a whole new crop of, younger people coming out of into their young adulthood, I think, who are more used to working alongside people of different ethnicities, different cultures, different genders, different sexual orientations, and they're much more accepting. And I think that the types of discrimination that they might see happen to their friends or to themselves is gonna outrage them, enrage them, and they're gonna fight against it. So I think I think the fair housing movement will continue on, and the federal government will eventually have to come around to aggressive enforcement again after we get through a rough period, I think, in the next couple of years, perhaps. But people should be able to live where they want to live without any barriers or impediments or bias or prejudice. And I think most Americans agree with that.
Yes. And it's well established, backed by research, that the need is clearly there to enforce the laws that are there. And I truly appreciate what you said. And I'm hopeful because there are new generations of lawyers who are coming out and wanting to do this work and wanting to find their space in having justice be for everyone in this country. So I share with you that that hope, the hope for the future.
Yeah.
So Attorney Dane, I truly appreciate you being here. You've had an extraordinary career, as I said at the top of this. You've received so many different awards for your civil rights work, from the Advocates of Basic Legal Equality, from HUD, from the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. You're one of the best lawyers in America in the field of civil rights. And I guess you're a self-professed math nerd, and you like science. You call yourself a science geek. So what's next for you? Are you going to now spend some time in the math world or science world and do some things in that space?
No. I will confess that I continue to read math books. books about mathematical principles. That's of interest to me. But Corey, I have 10 grandchildren now.
Yes.
They almost all of them live near me. And today, in fact, is my babysitting day for one 2-year-old granddaughter. So that's pretty much keeping me busy these days. And I still have one major piece of litigation that is pending. I've got a great team that I'm working with, a bunch of other lawyers, but I will remain not retired, at least until that case is over. So that's what I'll be doing. Thanks.
Well, that sounds great. And 10 beautiful grandchildren, that will take up most of your time, I'm sure.
It does. It does.
And it's such a blessing to see a new generation who are able to learn from you and make an impact in the community just as you have.
Well, thank you for having me. I very much appreciated the opportunity to talk with you.
Well, great. I appreciate you being here. Learned a lot. I hope that all of the different information that we shared today can be helpful for those who have tuned in. Again, this is Mental Wealth Wednesday, and we had attorney Stephen Dane, who joined us to talk about fair housing in celebration of National Fair Housing Month. And it is also Second Chance Month for those who are re-entering the community from institutions. So thank you again, Attorney Dane. You have a great evening.
Okay. Thank you. You too, Corey. Bye.